All right, go ahead, Gordon.
Okay. And if I've taken the conversation in the wrong direction, I'll retreat right away. But there is in the text, Jim and Rodney are want to right away say, look, and I'm going to read here. I'm right on the very first page. Therefore, Conrad-Martius never exercised a transcendental reduction, which disengaged the natural attitude of belief in the reality of the world's self-presentation, but rather she presupposed this attitude as, quote, hypothetically, close quote, valid. Now I'm coming to the sentence from which I asked the question. In making this presupposition, she was enabled to explicate the noematic correlate of the natural attitude. Okay, now I want to ask the question, how does, hang on here, I got to get my page back here. Okay, how does an attitude have a noematic correlate? An attitude, as I had always thought, was exactly a psychological thing. Attitudes don't exist out there. Attitudes exist in here. Now, one could say, if I'm a social psychologist, well, my attitudes exist in here and your attitudes for me exist out there, but that's not where we're going. So, and if I understood correctly, the lessons about the distinction between noetic contributions and noematic contributions in perception, I had it that my part of that was the noetic part, and what I got from the world was the noematic part. So now I return to the question, how does an attitude have a noematic correlate? And I'm helpful, and I'm grateful for all corrections.
Well, I'm not sure what she means when she talks about the noematic correlate of the natural attitude, but the whole concept of the noema is really kind of difficult, and I think is really at the very core of Husserl's whole philosophy. And so maybe let me just say a little bit about that. Husserl is a radical non-representationalist. There are no perceptual objects. We see the things themselves. What he means by the noema is not for example, if I see the tree outside of the window, what he means by the noema of the tree is not an image of the tree. It's not an image on the retina. It's not, it's not the causal system that results in some physiological events that relate to the brain. It is the tree as seen. What he means by noema is the object as experienced. And the object as experienced and the object experienced are the same object.
What, could you say that again, please, Jeremy? Just that's it.
The object experienced and the object as experienced are the same object. Noema, the definition of noema is object as experienced. And the core philosophical claim behind that is that the object as experienced is not a second object distinguishable from the object itself.
Are they identical?
They are identical, and yet it's a meaningful distinction. Now, that's a huge
That makes
problem.
no sense to me.
Well, you can say that, And I agree that it's a huge problem. However, when people, including me, work through how he describes this, especially in the Passages and Ideas 1, I say it does make sense.
Okay.
There is a way in which it does make sense when you really dig into what he's trying to say. And so I guess I just wanted to introduce that about what he means by noema. It's, yeah, there's, and I have a question too of what is going on here when we're applying the notion of noema to the world as such. Because normally in his analysis, he's talking about the noema means the object as experienced, namely an object you can experience, like a tree, you know, or even a proposition, an object. But is the world as such even an object? So I'm not quite sure what that phrase means in this chapter.
I'd like to add something. So I'm going to have a very more naive speakings, if that's the right word, than Jeremy just did. I remember reading things like that with Jeremy saying, but I'm going to say something differently. So the way I understand this, and we've been doing this for a while, Gordon, is that
Yeah, I know.
is that without noema, I can see nothing. There's no perception without noema. So when I see this tree outside my window, I'm glad that Jeremy brought that up because I have a tree outside my window and I look at it daily. And so in order for me to perceive this tree as a tree and as even this tree, I have to noetically be moving my eyes around and things like that. That's the part that you said, Gordon. That's our part. But I can't. But what I'm really doing when I do that is satisfying various criteria of confirmation that fit the noema. In other words, the noetic practice and the noema have to participate with each other. And the tree, in as much as the tree is a tree, has to work. We're all partners in this perception of the tree. The tree has to present itself in a certain way. I have to have the appropriate criteria that satisfy the noema of this tree that I have in my mind. And I have to be able to move my head around in the right ways to get all these things to agree. Anyway, that's my understanding. That's my simple-minded, seat of the pants understanding.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, could I just ask you directly, given what you said, which makes a lot of sense to me, and what Andreas said to the extent that I can, and Jeremy to the extent that I can get it, I'm grateful for it. How does that fit whatever kind of thing an attitude is?
And well, real quick, Sally, I think you had something to say.
No, I just wanted to quickly clarify that really what you just spoke about, Bill, is essence, right? We're talking, it's essentially essences.
Yes, but it's more than essence because in addition to noema, I need these criteria that identify what I'm doing with what this thing is. So it's not just the essence of the tree, it has to be certain criteria, and it may have to do with the time of day. I mean, it's very complex, I'm sure, to be able to describe all the criteria required for me to identify it as this tree or a tree.
Okay, but can I return to the question? How does an attitude have a noematic component?
Maybe we have to talk about what she means by this attitude. The attitude that we normally have been told, this natural attitude, is to sort of embrace or naively accept the fact that what we see, what we perceive is real. Isn't it something like that? The existence of what we perceive is real, whatever we mean exactly by real.
Right, the natural attitude means ineluctably, without even trying, without deciding, so to speak, automatically, we believe we are here in the world and there are things and people around us. That's the natural attitude. Husserl never disputes that. He never doubts that. this whole analysis does not have its aim to justify the natural attitude, but he reflects upon it. And so really the phenomenological reduction is, one way of putting it is, normally we are engaged with answering questions like, what is? Has the sun risen? Is the window open downstairs? What is the proof of the fundamental theorem of calculus, or whatever? There are questions we pursue about what is. And he says we are capable of holding back from our minds pursuing any such questions at all. And that is the phenomenological reduction. When we stop asking what is, and instead direct our attention to the appearing of what is. That's what he means by the reduction and by, in a sense, transcending the natural attitude. That's just, yeah.
Okay. Oh, Andreas, yeah.
Yes, please. Thank you so much. I can just contribute some things I remember. There are many noemata which need not necessarily have anything to do with the world. The relation between noesis and noema or noemata is very roughly a subject-object relation. The bridging between them being the intentionality, which has with Husserl and medieval European scholasticism not so much to do with our intentions, our directions of will and pursuits, but only means the directedness of the capability to perceive something mentally, this directedness which is regularly pointing at some, let's say, object. Now, let's discard for a moment everything we think we must suppose concerning the world. I can ask myself, what kind of conclusion is this or that conclusion? I can say, this is the logical syllogism by the title of ABC and so on. Now, this is also an is judgment, but with no claim so as to existence. It is, in the full sense of the word, but without pertaining to some notion of world. Now, noema does not have to do very much with objects, let alone with the world. But if I can single out some perceptive, imaginative, or conceptual content, be it well or less well defined, as an analogon to an outward object in my stream of consciousness, and if I can grasp it and deal with it and handle it and so on, then it is a noemata under the aspect of a content in my phenomenological stream of experience. Then it is a noema, plural noemata. And thus, the whole world in the naive attitude has a very macroscopic, conceitedly, but has the rank of a very bulky object, of a noema. The whole world, from the viewpoint of the transcendental attitude, is but one immense and maybe multiformly boundless and infinite object, so to say, noema. Now, the attitude is absolutely nothing psychological with Husserl, if I'm not caught wrong, for he fights so much against psychologism. It is something which has to do with primordial and aspects, categories, typologies in the mind, which cannot be derived from brain states, social behavior, or so on, as is often done in psychology. A certain attitude can be spoken of under terms of its noematicity, of its being noema, in as much as we can step back from it metaphorically and free our noesis, which is always more in the background and always more all-encompassing as everything which it can objectify. So the attitude becomes a certain type of constitution or habituality or accent to our grasping, which we carry onto some field of experience or onto some minor object. I think it can be explained this way.
Well, that's beautifully put. Thank you. I need to reflect on all that.
I think it's also important to bear in mind the general positions of someone like Aristotle and the ancient Greeks, like real generally, with the emphasis on nous and this, you know, I mean, that's the root of these terms, but also the kind of heuristic device, or if you have the attitude where it's not just a thought experiment, but rather is something that you can fully be engaged with and entertained by, the epoche is a meditative practice. This is in the instance of, you know, the Stoics, and then there are various traditions that this is influenced of meditation, but generally it's a meditation. It's a holding back, as Jeremy put it at some point earlier, but it could also be a holding forth. You know, when you see this circle, you know, it's more than a circle, and like there's a psychological layer, there's a natural layer, you know, there's all these layers. There's an imaginative layer. I can like imagine this is actually a tunnel, and if I turn it, you know, you'll see the length of it, or whatever, you know. You could be going through various sorts of thought experiments as you adumbrate this thing without even turning it, you know, just to get at its essence even more so. And by its essence, I don't mean just a circle. That's one way of looking at it. It's really this coaster, this thing made of this particular kind of material with, you know, so I mean, we hold it forth, you know, and we could hold it back, and we should hold back all the presuppositions about it if we want to get to the essence of what it really is. Like, it might be better not to look at it over Zoom mediated, you know, through this computer image, but to be here, this would be much better to get a better idea of its essence. You know, you can't smell it through Zoom or bite it, you know. So what this thing is has a real essence in the sense of like my you know, natural experience of it on this side of the Zoom screen, and but there's more than a natural being of this thing. You know, we know this because there's, you know, different manifestations of it in the imagination and etc. But we also know there are different non-natural objectivities, like number. And indeed, this is like maybe represents a debate in the philosophy of mathematics, whether numbers can be reduced to various sorts of things. But, you know, there is objectivity in that domain of the imagination. So we naturally, in fact, hold forth things like the presence of the book. You know, this is, I'm not just like some computer wizard making a simulation of it here for you to all think that I actually have the book here. You know, I could be, if I'm using like the, you know, the techniques that our new TV shows employ. It's possible, but you know, or even the whole world could be a simulation, right? So this is the idea of this kind of meditation. They're all Cartesian meditations, and ultimately, what I am most immediately and directly in touch with is this transcendental ego, you know, which doesn't present itself, but is the foundation for all these things that do present themselves. So this is the kind of thought experiment that goes on at the center of transcendental phenomenology. So if you think of like the transcendental, ego and the extensions of this kind of Cartesian thinking about that apodicticity of subjectivity, of this, pure subjective core as being extended to things and them being described transcendentally in transcendental phenomenology, there's a kind of inverse situation going on through a different set of thought experiments that we naturally employ, and maybe opposite the direction of the transcendental epoche, transnaturally employ as we go even beyond the natural presentation of things. When we see the circle, and we know that it's more than just a coaster, we hold it forth, so it's like an epoche, right? And there's this description of it somewhere here early on in the book, the realontological reduction. It's maybe the opposite of a reduction, it's more like a positing of the thing. The word is like holding open, or a heuristic reduction, where you hold the thing, so you can imagine how like this is kind of like doing an eidetic phenomenology, but of the natural world, and then going even farther and going into the realm of potentiality in which it is constituted, and considering a space or whatever, metaphorically, like a region, a realm, a sphere, or whatever, where all these transnatural potencies can occur, and then
I think one thing that on the same page, I think Hart is saying something that relates directly to what you're saying, and what also Andreas, am I saying your name right? Andreas? It was asking.
Andreas, yes.
Andreas was asking about, and I think is very interesting. I'm not sure what to make of it, but in the very second paragraph, let's see.
What page is it?
Page, this is the very beginning of chapter 8, 235, the second paragraph. So the analysis takes place within the context or the bracketing of the epistemological question, which the commitment to the issues themselves involved, as well as the eidetic reduction, which seeks to grasp the essence as such. It did not, however, involve a transcendental reduction, which Conrad-Martius believed made impossible an essence analysis of the real. And if I understand right, Realontology has everything to do with whatever she means by the essence analysis of the real. And she's claiming that that's incompatible with Husserl's phenomenological reduction. I'm not sure what to make of that. Is it true that it really is incompatible?
Right.
I think Hart has his doubts about that too, but I think this is kind of at the core of the whole issue of perhaps the compatibility between Husserl's phenomenology and any kind of philosophy of nature. And it seems like Conrad-Martius felt that in order to develop a phenomenal philosophy of nature together or as part of or based on or allied to phenomenology, you had to radically reconceive the whole idea of the reduction. Now, is that really true or not? But I really think that's a core issue here that does relate to how the two are linked together.
Yeah, I agree. That's very helpful, Jeremy. It really is. Where phenomenology for Conrad-Martius was not merely the phenomenology of perception. I'm reading on the second page of the conclusion, nor could it, and here there's some typos that that can trip us up, nor could it be merely an eidetic or existential analysis of our life work. Now, I had thought that eidetic analysis was exactly essence analysis, because I thought eidos pointed to essence. But there's a distinction being made here that I don't follow that distinguishes eidetic analysis from essence analysis. And I don't get that because I had thought that eidetic analysis was essence analysis.
I think it's an inclusive disjunction. What page is that?
All right, it's, I will tell you in 1 second.
236.
It's 230, yeah, 236. And it's, if you see it, it's the beginning of the second full paragraph on the page. Phenomenology for Conrad-Martius.
So
Can I
there
say
is
something briefly about that? Because this is something that I tried to get clear at the very beginning of our discussions and never really felt that I had. And I wish Jim was here. Because it seems, because the thing is that, remember, she's always moving from the finished world to an unfinished world. And this is where her analysis leads her. In fact, she has something very interesting to say in this translation, I guess we'll read next week, in which she says that any understanding of the metaphysics, if you like, of the finished world cannot be derived from any notions of the finished world. It has to move beyond the finished world to something prior to it. And that's what I think he means by that sentence. Nor can it be merely an eidetic of existential analysis of our life world. She wants to go beyond our life world. I didn't even realize you said that. Our life world is the natural attitude world, isn't it? So yeah, she's looking for something which is beyond a human perception. It's a non-human, so it's not a phenomenology, I guess, because it's beyond the humanness. Isn't that what she's aiming for?
Well, it's explained in the introduction that late work is not only a continuation of the realontological method through the material in the 30s and the 40s, all the different sciences that we've seen, but is also a ideal ontology. So it's both, she's establishing a real ontological method and her own ideal ontological method. This is the kind of move you see in Nikolai Hartmann, for instance, as well as other figures connected with, ontology generally. Yeah, so she's giving us methods to go through that pre-finished and other, constitutive dimensions of experience. If you think about causality, the billiard balls are moving, seeming to cause each other on the natural finished world surface, right? But really, all the billiard balls are like radiating from that world center and also being projected from that world periphery onto that surface to constitute what's happening there. So what appears to be causality on that world surface is actually happening at the same time from the world center and the world periphery, in different senses, because in some respects there's this aeonic world periphery, but in another respect there's this weird, this other category she brings up, the apeirotic space-time dimension, which seems to span both center and periphery. So the pre-finished, and maybe you could even say the post-finished, the non-finished realm can be looked at in terms of like these transphysical dimensions that she invents as heuristic devices in order to understand how this stuff could work. And there's probably other ways of going about it as well, but having like a method is really important when you're going through all those strange new worlds.
So just it's another thought that occurred to me. So what Husserl is about largely, and for that matter, most phenomenologists are about, is the work of the transcendental ego. What is the transcendental ego doing? How does it accomplish its
Right.
world? Conrad-Martius who has to get out. She has to get the transcendental ego is in the way. She has to get beyond the transcendental ego to that which is outside, beyond the transcendental ego, and that's what makes her. I don't even know if we should call it a phenomenology. It's
Well,
really
you know,
a physical enterprise.
it could also be that it's not the transcendental ego that's the enemy of her method, but rather the idealism that is all about the transcendental ego and only the work of the transcendental ego as being like, you know, the really real world beyond the world of phenomena, you know, because there's something about the world itself, and Husserl goes there as well in different ways. So, you know, like Hart explained in the a couple chapters ago, where he talks about the, you know, the earth, the originary arc does not move, this famous essay. You know, the theme of the world, of the horizon, you know, this can be found in every phase of Husserl's phenomenological work, and as well in other kinds of phenomenology and in other kinds of philosophy. You know, it's just that thematic of the world.
I think another way to go at it, and again, thinking about this question of the whole idea of developing a philosophy of nature congruent with, or in some way based on, phenomenology, is the relationship of the ego to the lived body and to the physical body, which Husserl does deeply and extensively explore, especially in Ideas 2, which is much less read than anything else. And I think this is how I kind of see the core issue, which is Husserl does talk about causality, and physical causality is something we experience going on in the world. But he also talks about, I think, physical causality as related to the lived body. We obviously experience things that we have to understand as involving physical causality, like, you know, falling down or getting sick, or the activity of our bodies, or what they call psychophysics. So the question, but then he makes the distinction very clearly between the sort of what makes the mind do something versus what makes bodies do something. And he distinguishes between motivation as that which what makes the mind do something, and physical causality. So, for example, an example of motivation would be to look at the steps of a mathematical proof and understand that they are true. That would be one example. But everything about consciousness is, the reason for it falls under the category of motivation, which is teleological. So then, to me, the question, we've talked about this before, and I think this is the core question, and maybe something which exposes the limits of phenomenology. We know that our bodies and our minds and the ego, all of whose activities are motivated, is bound to a lived body, which is also a physical body, which is subject to physical causality. How is that possible? And how is it possible that this physical body is fashioned, is structured in such a way that things happen in such a way that it cooperates with the activities, with motivated activities? And is it, in other words, I believe that if you want to understand that, you have to do what Conrad-Martius is doing, which is to recognize teleology in nature. That's the core. And then how do we understand that? And I think her whole project, teleology.
And archaeology.
I don't know what you mean by that. Anyway, and how do you understand that? And I think she is really working on that. and all this, to me, I don't know if it's the final answer. The more I've worked at it, at least does make sense. At first, this stuff about the world center and periphery, that I had no idea what she was talking about. But I don't know, just impressionistically, it starts to make sense now. But the point I'm making, I think the motivation for it is to try to understand nature teleologically. And so the question is, how do we know that? Do we understand nature in the same way we understand our own consciousness? Can we understand nature in the same way? Or is it a matter of a kind of inference? Are there certain, and I think that is for what it's worth, I would propose that as the core question about whether and in what way it may be possible to link phenomenology to a philosophy of nature. How can we understand nature as teleological? And what is the nature of any kind of evidence that we might point to or experience that would support our speculations, our concepts that describe nature in that way?
Sally?
I just have a quick question. I want to know what you think, Jeremy, when you're describing that. My impression is that with the teleology component here, it's implicit, if not explicit, that she's talking about creation.
Yeah, of course. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I mean, that's because that's what I've gotten all along, that's where she's been going with this, so okay.
Mm-hmm. Right, nature can't be a mere mechanism. It must be made for a purpose. It must be somehow made to be integrated with consciousness in a certain way. However, she's not, and then the problem is when you try to talk that way or try to understand that, casually we say things all the time, like, how does a seed know how to become an oak tree? But then if you want to say, well, okay, somehow we can see that somehow it knows how to become an oak tree. And yet we know that's only a metaphor and an analogy. But so then what is that metaphor pointing to? We don't know. But I think we can say that a merely mechanistic view of nature cannot possibly explain how a seed becomes an oak tree, or how eyeballs can be used to see things with.
Oh, wait a minute. Wait a minute. No, wait a minute. I think that's going too far.
Why is that going too far?
Because, I mean, are we going to recreate the entire Dover versus, the whole Dover school board case regarding intelligent design? No,
Why not?
I hope not.
Why not? Why not? Why?
Because
that's
Judge,
a straw man.
and
What's the argument?
The answer is at more than 100 pages, Judge Jones laid out very clearly why every example that was raised saying this cannot possibly have a mechanistic explanation. Can't possibly, it's too complicated.
It's not because it's too complicated. That's
well,
what they always say, but that's not the reason.
Well, what then I have yet to hear what the reason is that says, well, we simply have to move to purpose because mechanism, causality won't get us there. And in my own thinking,
well, I've got an argument. I can sum it up. Oh, go ahead.
Well, and I really want to hear it. I just want to finish this sentence.
Sure. I'm sorry.
That I get it's at the very beginning. At the very beginning, I have no idea what kicks the universe out of stasis. Once it gets kicked out, then
of what?
out of stasis, out of stillness, out of quiet. What moves the initial? I mean, that's the question. What is the prima mobile? What's the first mover? Why did things begin? Once they've begun, causal analysis is unbelievably brilliant in getting
agree.
answers. And well then,
But there are some questions you can't answer.
well, okay, and I'm waiting for those questions
Okay, I've got it.
to be asked.
Here's my answer.
That's okay.
Okay.
Okay, then I am all ears.
Okay, here we go. I think I can sum it up. Okay, I can understand the Pythagorean theorem and the proof. And the activities that my mind engaged in there are clearly teleological. The reason my thinking proceeds in the way that it does is not some prior cause, but the truth of the propositions and the connections. That is the reason for the thinking. The very truth of the propositions is the reason for the thinking. And that excludes sheer determination by prior causation. So suppose I then explain and work through the Pythagorean theorem and its proof. Physical action events are occurring. My tongue is moving in a certain way, etc. The reason for those physical events occurring must then be, finally, the truth of the Pythagorean theorem. And if that's true, then that excludes sheer physical determination, because if it was sheerly physically determined, the relationship between the truth and the Pythagorean theorem and those events would be purely random, which means it couldn't exist at all. That's the reason.
Can I ask a question? So
Yeah.
I thought we started this discussion by talking about teleology, and I don't understand why what Gordon said excludes teleology. I mean, can we do that with the acorn? I'm pretty sure that we could probably start with an acorn and plant it in the ground or whatever we do. And we could probably make some causal links to an oak tree. So it doesn't seem to me that causality discounts teleology. In fact, it may rely upon it.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to say no causality is involved. I'm saying a sheerly deterministic account of physical causation makes life and consciousness and conscious embodied life impossible. And obviously, causation is involved, and that's the challenge of how to explain how it relates to activities which are purposive, which include me explaining the Pythagorean theorem or include a seed growing into an oak tree.
Well, so this is, the big discussion, and since we're like towards the end of this book, I did open by asking for the big discussion, but maybe we should try to tie it more tightly to the arguments offered here, which they're here. We're talking about chapter 8, and it's the conclusion. We did bring up a few points from it, but I just want to tie it a bit more to that, because we're not just, debating, right, like teleology versus, we did that in, what was it, chapter 4, where we opened with developmental biology and the issues of preformatism and epigenesis and entelechy, etc. And this certainly this kind of discussion does carry over, because when we talk about that court case, I'm not familiar with it, but when we think of like all the neuroreductiveness happening these days, we can see how like there's a kind of preformatism, like a genetic, like a physiological genetic preformatism that people fall into in the contemporary natural attitude of the natural sciences of cognitive psychology, right? We just think that that our thoughts are genetically determined, right? Or that the unfolding of the oak tree from the seed is all just genetic, It is also genetic in that sense, But the phenomenological kind of genetics, goes much deeper and also connects that kind of genetic analysis to lived experience, which comes down to not only the life world, but to oneself, to the ipseity in its various forms of the itselfness, the selfhood, and all these terms we find in Conrad-Martius's philosophy, and that kind of stuff, indicates these categories of what's sometimes called archaeology, that goes down to this arche, this arche of the I, or in various idealisms, like famously in Fichte, right? But here there's also this primordial selfness, this itselfness that is also characteristic of substantiality, right? Material substantiality as well as noematic or spiritual substantiality. And it's more the noematic substantiality that the I that we think of as like this transcendental ego, but maybe is more a kind of psychistic substance and not totally transcendental. There's like a whole realm of distinguishable itselfnesses to the experience of the self, even to the one that we have fully here in the real space-time context. And if we bracket that space-time context, we still have that self and that nucleus of various self arche.
The real puzzling, difficult problem is, how do we, I think we can conclude that nature must be teleological, but in what sense, and the way she talks about the in-selfnesses of nature makes them somehow analogous to conscious beings.
Or at least living beings, if not conscious.
Well, there's some, and I think we can conclude that something like that must be true, but we don't experience that. We don't experience the consciousness of an atom or even the consciousness of a plant. And she actually has a article about plants, which I haven't read. So I guess that's the challenging part, especially when it comes to phenomenology.
I got a question. Now we're talking about teleology, and so causation as time has a direction, but she means more by teleology than just that that causality has a direction. As I understand, it's the working out of intellects and essences that are already embedded in the world. And so I don't understand, that seems, if that's what she means by teleology, I don't think anyone can disagree. I don't understand what the disagreement would be. So she must mean more by teleology than what I just said.
Can I tell you how I interpret it? Is that
go ahead, Sally.
That there's this self-engendering component to life, whether it's a person or an animal or a plant, this self-engendering component, and that in and of itself, then, therefore, it is teleologic. That's how I'm going with this. It's this, automatic self-engendering, which is both a mystery, and yet my impression is that she's implying or explicitly saying that this is, a reproduction of the creator, which has been and always has been. No? That's what I'm getting from it.
Well, perhaps Sally, and maybe some of you, maybe not all of you, but some people might like it this way as well. If you consider that she's deeply influenced by, I mean, she's doing theology. She's doing natural science and theology, which is quite a feat already just to juggle those, right? But she's doing it so masterfully because she's coming from a deeper place, and in some of these like mystical philosophies, as well as perhaps in the more esoteric side of Plato and Aristotle themselves. Certainly we see this with the Neoplatonists who come later, but perhaps even with themselves and with the parallel Hermetic tradition, both the ancient and the Renaissance, there's this view that the self in the transcendental sense is this an arche and a telos, the arche kai telos, right? And one way of looking at this is in the symbol of the Ouroboros, right? The snake eating its own tail. So here you have the arche and telos so closely intertwined that probably it's not even really a snake that you can see. It would have to be like, a symbol for this ubiquitous center of all centers, the one, in this mystical sense. So, but if you consider that it's at this level of analysis, at this most archaeologically deep genetic level, it's arche and telos together, subject and object so tightly together that there is no active seeing, no perspective, no distance yet. And yet this unfolds. And this gives us all the archaeology and corresponding teleology, all the noetic and noematic, all the cognitive and the cogitata correlations of various organizations of world. You kind of can take that snake that's a circle and show it like wrapping out, on this staff of the what's that staff called? Right, the mercurial. Yeah, so I think that's the unfolding of nature. Can be looked at like this. It's an unfolding, an opening up of the arche and telos in a way that preserves the relationship between that arche and telos that is Ouroboros, in the sense of the that primordial self, that primordial snake.
Well, I don't see why I can't present the same picture by a makeup. I mean, so in mythology, I say we take the Big Bang. We'll start with that mythos and say that in the beginning, there was a Big Bang. And in the Big Bang, there was written into the Big Bang various principles, arches. And also, there were also, who knows what, tiny distances or tiny other things, distances between things, or whatever. I don't know, whatever it is. But from there on out, there's the unfolding of the universe in time and space, maybe the making of space. And it resulted in life on the planet Earth and who knows where else. And all these things are teleological. They're written into the beginning. I don't know why that picture is any different from what you just said.
Well, one question that occurs to me is if we think about the universe as including beings that do things or beings that are involved in events, and if you even have the idea of a principle at all, namely that an event would follow some kind of rule, the question even there remains, like for the laws of motion, why do the events follow that rule? And even that is teleological. And that's exactly what science can explain. You can talk about, here are all these causal explanations, and lots of things can be explained causally using mathematical rules like the laws of motion. But then that's leaving out a huge question, like I just said. Why do the events obey the rules at all?
That's exactly what I'm saying, Jeremy.
Yeah. And so, but then unless there's some kind of consciousness involved, that doesn't make sense. The whole idea of doing something to follow a rule because of the meaning of that rule seems to imply consciousness.
I don't know if it implies
I think that debate is more you know, a contemporary theological / social debate. I don't know, maybe she talks about that elsewhere, but here it's not so much consciousness as something more like life, you know, in the sense of like a Whiteheadian process, you know. I mean, maybe because she's a Christian, it has to be consciousness or something.
But Whitehead does talk about everything as conscious according. He's a panpsychist, even subatomic particles.
Okay,
if I understand correctly, what Whitehead is quite similar because he talks about God as being the factor that offers possibilities to what he calls it occasions of experience. And so occasions of experience, if I understand Whitehead correctly, the only difference between me as an individual human being and the occasion of experience of a subatomic particle is that the possibilities offered by God for the actions of that subatomic particle are so much more tightly restricted. And so, but maybe I'm wrong about Whitehead, but I think he has kind of a simplistic idea that actually consciousness is the explanatory factor everywhere. And is that true? And
I just feel like in the debate, it's kind of twisted into like consciousness, like the consciousness of mortals, like someone designing is a little bit different than, you know, consciousness in the Whiteheadian actual entity, where it's the subject, superject, or the two sides of the same coin. You know, that's like a different kind of situation. That's more amenable to both natural scientific and theologic and Conrad-Martius type stuff than the debate in the courtroom that Gordon was referring to.
Well, in the popular awareness, well, I think the problem with public awareness is that they don't really ask fundamental philosophical questions. And I'm putting one there. Why does anything obey any rules at all? That doesn't even get asked. People don't even think about that. And yeah.
Can I turn to the text?
Yes, please.
Okay, I want to go to something that we have not revisited, but I think is profound in what Conrad-Martius has to say. I'm going to turn to page, let's start on page 236. And I'll wait for people to get there before I read it and then ask my question. There are probably lots of questions here, but I've got at least one. So in the very last sentence of page 236, he has to start with this horrible word, thus. So I'll just ignore that thus and say, thus Conrad-Martius empties out space, and the familiar cozy world in which we find ourselves becomes unheimlich because it is essentially transcendental and ontologically non-transversible. Now, I don't know what he means by any of that mostly, but I'll keep reading. Conrad-Martius argued that we think best ontologically of space in the sense of the verbs. We were talking about space, so let's finish with space. Space to make verbs to make sense, to make room, to make place. We've talked about this before, and I understood that better. Properly speaking, it is not space which is constituted, but body mass. Space is not something which can be affected really, because matter is constituted. Matter is conceived as a place-making reality. In matter's constitution, space is created, that is, as a dimension or a place-making being. So my stupid question is, what does Jim mean, at least, by constituted? Who or what is constituting matter? In matter's constitution, space is, what is it? This actually, I mean, I can't help thinking, but there's somehow or other, this is not the Husserlian understanding of constitution, but more of a creative understanding of constitution, which matters creation or something. So that's my question.
I think, I'm not sure I understand this either, but I was just thinking about this morning. And I think what may be going on here when he's talking about and when she talks about individual finite beings making space rather than being in a somehow pre-existent space. What does she mean by that? I think the idea is that, and I think it's a very interesting question, and I was asking myself this very question: what do we mean by something finite and specific and determinate? What does that even mean? And what does it even mean that, and apparently we can experience finite, specific, determinate things. Here's a rock, here's a organism, here is another organism. But if we think about, okay, well, what are the limits? What do we mean by these finite and specific limits? And it occurred to me one day to ask the question, what does that even mean, finite? Does finite mean infinitely determinate? And it does not. And I think that's the core point, because infinite determination is the same as no determination at all. And what's going on there? For example, and Husserl talks about this as the origin of geometry. Okay, we immediately experience finite determinate things, but what happens when we try to measure them? Well, there's no limit to how precisely we can measure their dimensions. It's infinite. And I think that's what she means by the apeirotic space, that if we think about space as infinitely divisible, it's bottomless, it's groundless. So I think that's what she means by the way that an individual being constitutes space, because an individual being, in being finitely determinate, is not creating an infinitely, it's not infinitely determinate. And finite determination is sui generis. It's not something that can be made out of or based upon that which is infinitely determinate. And the only thing that gives us any definite determination is a definite object. So the definite dimensions of any finite object come from the being of that object and not from the apeirotic space in which we think they're located. And the reason I think she says that space is transcendental and imaginative is that this idea of a space in which everything is simply a carrying further out of the space we directly experience in our grasping of particular finite determinate spatial objects. So I don't know if that, and I think that's what the point is supposed to be, although I'm not sure.
Well, that was very interesting, Jeremy. I'm not even sure where you're referring to the text, but I grasped a lot of what you just said, and I've had similar thoughts. So I do see, so let me just say this another way. I do see that we are imaginatively making space. I mean, because like you say, I mean, the space that we imagine right now, we're sitting where we are, is unbounded. It's in a sense, it's unbounded, even though it's much further than what we can see or touch or experience. Everything is embedded in. So that has to be, it's not a matter of perceptions. That's something that we imaginatively constitute in some sense. But that doesn't get to my real question, because I was talking about matter, and maybe I don't know what she means by matter, as because matter is constituted. Matter is, and it says in that sentence, because matter is constituted, matter is conceived as a place making reality. Because matter is constituted, who or what is constituting matter? It's not, it can't be phenomenological. That's not what she means. It's something else. So what is doing the constituting?
I think it's perfectly phenomenological. I
Oh,
mean,
you do? Okay.
well, like consider when you usually talk about the space something occupies, like say you go to IKEA and you want to get a new sofa, you need to know the dimensions of that part of the room that you want to fill with a sofa, right? But those are infradimensional, let's say, you know, it's like 6 units by 3 units by 4 units in a 3-dimensional space, right? And that approximates the basic pirata, right? The limitations that you're looking for. But that's within the context of a relativistic framework. It only makes sense infra-dimensionally. And when you move outside of that context, when you try to think of things, I think in the phenomenological sense of constitution, but also maybe there is another sense that's more like ontological, where we have to consider something in relation to nothing, or maybe in relation to the beyond of being in the opposite direction, right? This kind of beyond of being in the sense of like the infinite, whatever you want to call it. You know, being has to be situated in some kind of non-being situation. And the idea of something with its specific determination, its specific dimensionality in the context of a dimensionless, whatever that would be, you know, it wouldn't be simply located in relation to the sofa, the dimensionless space that the sofa is in, like a supra world space, you know, but that is where things would ultimately come from if we consider the pre-finished cosmos, or, you know, just beyond the givenness of things infra-dimensionally. You know, things are somehow coming from the void, or whatever you want to call it, the infinite. You know, or if you're theological, you might call that God, but God as the infinite sphere. Or if you're strictly idealistic phenomenological, coming from the transcendental ego as like this infinitesimal center. You know, of course, it shouldn't be thought of only as an infinitesimal center, like a point that has lines of radiation coming, you know, and filling the 3-dimensional volume of the sphere or the body or the sofa. You know, but that is one way of conceiving of that. You know, and however the phenomenologist, in the sense of you know, the genetic constitutional phenomenology analyses could describe something in relation to the transcendental ego, there might be a corresponding, you know, ontological constitution of things, which also would necessarily have to be the case if things have substantiality, have a hyletic and or pneumatic, or whatever you want to call that, substantiality. You know, they have to like come from somewhere, because why is there something rather than nothing? The famous Leibnizian Heideggerian way of putting that question is something that accompanies the basic fundamental intuition of the world, which is always present in the background.
You know, I've been hoping that Andreas has raised his hand on a number of occasions, and he's reticent. Andreas, would you please express what you've been wondering about?
Thank you so much. I just wanted to add some minor aspects. Causality need not spring from world experience. One's consciousness, maybe out of God's overabundance, dissects itself into countless individual consciousnesses. Then we get that sphere of intersubjectivity, interpersonality. And we can imagine encounters between immaterial, even non-spatial consciousnesses, encounters which are somehow metric, so to say, that their events which they live through, which each other constitute for each particular other something new, which brings to them effects which can in so much be addressed as caused by such an event, which another consciousness may impose onto me by transmitting some state of his or hers into my consciousness telepathically or the like. So at the very moment that we leave the narrow but absolute apodicticity of the transcendental ego's tenets, and we enter into the first periphery of lesser justifiability, that is the realm of intersubjectivity, we already get some causality. So causality is not bound to physics, causality is not bound to the body, although it ever more preponderantly so comes to appertain to the body and then to the dead matter and so on as we think of it. And on the other hand side, a true and pure limit value of materiality, of sheer necessity, of total subjectedness to causality would be unconceivable to us, for we have to approach everything under the nature of our spirituality, by which I mean now our being spirits only. So there is, as Randy said it, there is that central ego, which establishes necessarily a direct relation with each object, which it identifies with themselves, as it always will identify itself with itself. The I identifies with the I always, and it can't but identify the objects of its grasping with themselves. So there is a centrical pole and a peripherical pole, and the pure peripherical pole would be the ahoristos duas, the wholly undetermined not oneness, so to say, the ahoristos duas. And therefore, I think I begin to understand what HCM is trying to do, but I see a danger here. For if we plainly apply the method of analogy, for example, creation opens space for us so as to fill it with our being in space, or with our flesh, or with our point of subject, then we are, please correct me, but I think we are in a circular argument, in a circular chain of argument. Could anybody of you please tell me what might be the surplus value gain from HCM's method compared to Husserl's? For really still until this moment, I'm still just a Husserlian, not an HCM adherent. And I wonder whether we can't do as much justice as we are supposed to purely with Husserl's method, because if we try to bring order for ourselves in the totality of our stream of experiences by applying those manners and fashions which Husserl helped to unveil in the transcendental ego and its operations, isn't it true that we can do as much justice as we can ever be expected to do if we just proceed like this, maybe in a transcendentally and anthropomorphic fashion? Now, if HCM tries to find again theological self-formation, self-affirmation, self-engendering, as Sally had it, then aren't we very close to the fallacy of analogous thinking?
Well, I thank you for all of that. I think you open the door to the possibility, I think, of wondering whether the step that HCM makes it is her prior religiosity that Husserl either would not or either did not have or would not express even if he did, because he was getting in enough trouble as it was.
Mhm.
He had to lie low and at a certain point and couldn't even speak in his own country.
Mhm.
So I've had this kind of haunting sense that the elaborations of HCM are in the service of finding the best possible way that she can to persuade that her prior commitments to Christian theology are correct.
Mhm.
And that much of her, I wouldn't say all, but much of her work is in that apologetic
Mhm.
sense,
Mhm.
including the this elaborate effort to justify a heavenly realm,
Mhm.
and which is what this was all about, was heaven.
Mhm.
And I was particularly struck by it, and here I think that's all. I mean, I think that the position I've just taken, I could be justified by looking at her text, but if I can extend it just a little bit, I got to that because I've been so moved recently by Wittgenstein and D.C. Phillips on religiosity,
Mhm.
where they, in a certain way, justify the use of all kinds of theological statements by saying we make a mistake if we think that those who are uttering those statements are uttering them as if they were making other kinds of existential statements. These
I
are
didn't.
different.
I didn't
They
get
are
the last part of your sentence acoustically. Could you please say it again, because it appears very important.
that Wittgenstein, and particularly as D.C. Phillips elaborates him, insisted that we mistake what kind of talk religious talk is. Now, I think that the reference there was to lay people. But in his book, Religion Unexplained, Phillips has as a last chapter a series, he begins it with a series of comments by Moore, G.E. Moore, that Moore took to be unassailable. They were empirical statements that Moore took to be unassailable. And what the two of them, what Wittgenstein and Phillips did was to say there are lots of statements like that at a certain point it doesn't make sense to ask the epistemological question anymore. The nature of the assertion is not such that it wavers or the speaker's willingness to stand firm as an assertion no longer can be attacked by saying, well, how do you know?
Well, so I think what you're referring to is something like Wittgenstein's certainties. And G.E. Moore makes the famous statement, I have a left hand, or this is my left hand.
Those are the ones. There's a bunch of those.
Right. And yeah, I read that 1905, whatever it is, text many years ago. And Wittgenstein refers to things like there was a yesterday, those kinds of things. So I get that. But I'm not sure what your point is. I mean,
Right.
I'm not sure what your point you're trying to make.
Well, okay, yeah. And part of it is you notice that the epistemological questions are bracketed by HCM explicitly. That's laid out quite clearly. So there is an overlap. They're saying, look, we are beyond asking the epistemological question. Now, whether or not that takes us right to the kind of phenomenology that she does do, essence phenomenology, which, and here I'm confused, is not to be confused with either eidetic or existential reduction, and I'm already in over my head at that point. There seems to be this effort to say, look, what Wittgenstein and Phillips are doing, saying you can have that strictly religious claims, which appear to be claims of belief, are not claims of belief like, quote, ordinary, close quote, claims of belief, even though, as Moore wanted to argue, some very ordinary claims of belief really would be silly to challenge them on epistemological grounds. I have two hands. How do you know you have two hands? We would never have such a conversation. And if somebody standing there with two hands says, I don't know how I have two hands, one says, well, I wouldn't consider that person to be deep. I think him either stupid or deranged. And so now the question is, what is the class of religious statements for which that's true? If it's true for these simple ones, what is the limit of apparent assertions of fact, declarative statements, indicative statements, whatever grammatically, for which asking the question, well, how do you know, no longer makes sense? And Wittgenstein and Phillips are saying there's lots of them because of the nature of those language games. I mean, that's the Wittgenstein-Phillips line. Just from my point of view, I would love it if that were true. I think that would be terrific, but I can't get all the way there because I said, well, wait a minute, you guys now are doing anthropology and I want to see some data. I want to really know, I want to interview a bunch of people and find out how in fact they construe their own religious claims. Because that's what Wittgenstein appears to be doing implicitly. But now that takes me off on my own frolic. I wouldn't, that's not what this group is interested in.
Well, we're interested, but not what we're talking about right now.
But see, now it may be closer. I want to say, well, we may be closer to it than it appears, but thank you for listening to me on this point. I'll withdraw.
Well, you don't have to withdraw too far, but I would say that really what Conrad-Martius is doing is closer to metaphysics. And so we can ask that question about metaphysics. Now, of course, Wittgenstein was very anti-metaphysical, so we understand that. But so the question is, how do we regard metaphysics? Because that's what she's doing. And so to follow up on your intuition, my sense has been all along that because Andreas brought up this question about Husserl versus HCM, and so I've been suspicious all along that what she's really doing is really an exploration of the transcendental ego, and for the reasons very much like what Gordon just said. is that her very understandings of her metaphysics are probably informed by her historical being, by her Christianity, by Western metaphysics, et cetera, et cetera. And hopefully, I mean, I'm sure she tried to get past this, but the point is, because she's aiming for some sort of absolute truth, I think, which is what metaphysics is about, that she'd be aware of that. But nonetheless, the question is, what are we left with when we have any metaphysics? There seems to me, I mean, because I've studied this in terms of science, there's always metaphysics. We cannot escape metaphysics. But whether there is a meta-metaphysics is another question. That's all. I'll stop there.
What do you mean by meta-metaphysics?
Well, what I mean is there a metaphysics which is the final metaphysics? Maybe do I have to be Hegelian to say this? I don't know. Because like I said, metaphysics dominates our lives. We're unaware of it entirely. And I think that's what Conrad-Martius is trying to get at. And it may have some, probably, this is why it makes it the phenomenologies, because, she has to base her metaphysics upon her phenomenal experience, upon her experience of the world. But is that experience of the world necessarily different from a salamander? And maybe a salamander would have a different metaphysics. I don't know. I just don't know how you know when you've reached a metaphysics which is really meta. You know what I mean?
Well, I think that's a good, but what's an example of the way we can't escape metaphysics, or metaphysics dominates our lives, or even science?
Oh, it's been a while. There are lots of books written on this subject. Let me think if I can remember something.
Here, I can show us this Chalmers book, 2009, Meta-metaphysics. Okay.
Oh,
there's actually a book named Meta. I thought I just made that up.
Yeah, and of course, like, I mean, I think an issue with the term is that Aristotle is clear that, by metaphysics, the topic of the metaphysics, right, is ontology. And the title metaphysics, of course, means after the physics, but it deals with theology. And he even says that his ontology, prima philosophia, prote philosophia, is theology. So he identifies it with theology, and this is the science of being. But if you look at it in terms of its Platonic roots, then it includes also what we call not just ontology, but me-ontology, right? Which Jim is one of the world's authorities on this topic. But if you Google me-ontology, you get on the one hand people like Kitaro Nishida and Buddhist ontology, and what's also called shunyatology, the study of the shunyata, the nothing or whatever in Buddhism, and then categories in Conrad-Martius like das Nichts, that is so fundamental for people like Jakob Boehme and the mystics that she's looking at, that informs her kind of Christianity, right? But also like Levinas is another example that I think like the Wikipedia on me-ontology brings up. So I think that meta-metaphysics, maybe the Chalmers type of ontological works collected here, connects up with that sort of sense of what's happening. But I think for Conrad-Martius, the epikoneia tes ousias, the beyond of being in Plato, the sun, or the account of the father of the sun itself, that's really what the Ide and the great kinds, the 5 great kinds of Ide, of which being is one, comes from. And so there's a metaphysics already there with the first philosophy of Aristotle, not just being as being, but being as being in the light of the sun, in the light of the beyond of being, which could also then be connected with the apeiron of Anaximander, a figure we find in this chapter as well. Because for Anaximander, the important thing is this category of the limitless, the apeiron, and that would be beyond being, not just beyond limit, pyrrhata and pyrrhic space-time, which is a technical term for in Conrad-Martius for measured and dimensioned space-time, and also the usual space-time within that category that we experience.
I think everything you just said is also a good response to the idea that she is simply saying these things because she's a Christian. There's plenty. I think what she's talking about really does grow out of Plato and Aristotle.
Yeah.
And really, and Plotinus maybe, really more than out of Aquinas.
Yeah. Well, look at these categories.
And when you look, and it's really, I think if someone from a perspective of Orthodox Christian theology were to say, this sounds like pantheism to me, and therefore inconsistent with traditional Christian theology, I think she might have an answer, but she would have a hard time arguing against that. And this is something that Jim has brought up many times, her whole notion of creation. Jim doesn't want to say heresy. Maybe I don't want to say heresy, but many Orthodox theologians would call it heresy, because it's the idea that the role that she's giving to the we said it so many times, the periphery, this, what's the word for it?
The aeonic?
Yeah, the aeonic world periphery. That has the role of creating the world. And then Jim has said many times that she has said, how could God really be a creator unless he could create creators? And the whole world is a creation that is itself creative. This is not a concept in Orthodox Christian theology. It's something rooted perhaps more in Plato and Aristotle, or in a lot of these other people that Randy knows so much about. So I would just put all that in. There's so much about the reflection and the metaphysics and the cosmology that certainly, just to sum up, is a quite, at least in tension, if not alien to traditional theism, as you see, for example, in Aquinas.
She might have a hard time, but I think she could also flip the narrative on the people who are charging her with pantheism, because really what she's doing is, it's not like she's worshiping Apollo or something, she's a mystic. So these Greek categories, like Andreas brought up, the protos and epistrophe, the emanation and the return, and this kind of emanationist worldview, it might have its historical problems with creationism as two different doctrines, but they're ultimately on the same page in some important ways. And the aoristos dias, I wrote days in our chat, but dias, it auto-corrected. Right. That's the two. Aristotle talks about it all the time to characterize Plato and the Pythagoreans, and we get the sense this is what characterizes this kind of thinking, maybe even for both of them in some ways that are occluded.
And so you're taking it a next step further, is the whole tradition she's drawing on and the classical theistic tradition, are they in fact compatible? And you're saying,
or even
yes,
totally in agreement. I mean, if you entertain heuristically as a cosmic centering device, this mystical position, which totally works with the idealist phenomenology of the transcendental ego, if though it goes beyond it, as well. It's compatible with this idea of a radical, absolute central orientation point. It's just that it also gives us the radical, absolute periphery that in some respects was shed, and demythologized, and in the Newtonian kind of and Kantian, well, especially the Newtonian space as God, or the idea of the infinite sphere, you see these things get shed but it might just be their sedimented forms that get shed, and really their psychologistic appearances. And so by depsychologizing that, it's still like in moving in the phenomenological direction, and employing all these phenomenological analyses. And it could just be that
And I think what you're saying is that, sure, we can say her view is religiously based, but the basis is extremely capacious. She brings in all kinds of things, many of which certain, let's say, narrow-minded Christians don't want to hear about. But
well, we don't see Hegel's name thrown around too much in this context, but it's really a lot like bringing Hegel and Husserl and Heidegger together in important respects. And if you look at what Lambert and Kant and Fichte and this whole tradition of the early modern uses of the term phenomenology meant, they all referred to the ancient science of phenomena, the saving of phenomena, and the science of phenomena, and the science of appearances. And this ancient episteme has always been in its practical applications. So there is a standard for this in the ancient context. Equally as much the science of astronomy in the higher sense, not observational astronomy, but like conjectural astronomy, or the positing of the sphere. So in other words, like mathematical cosmology, it's been applicable as much as well, Lambert calls it transcendental optics. So it's just the science of perspective of the center and the sphere, in practical application in the areas of astronomy and optics in the ancient world. But there is this rich heritage of phenomenology that isn't really looked at too frequently in context in connection to what now we call phenomenology. Heidegger mentions it briefly, just referring to like the saving of appearances. You can go in the Owen Barfield kind of direction and look at it in terms of like history of ideas. Jean Gebser has a certain way about talking about the science of appearances and perspectivality, but the ancients had this science of the sphere, and maybe that's what Plato was talking about when he talked about like the higher science of astronomy, not like the observational astronomy of Homer in Republic Book 7, where he talks about the sciences. There's this. So I mean, I'm like, this is one of my interests.
I think another side of that, when you think about the activity, if you want to call it that, of the Ionic world periphery, she's not saying that's conscious, I don't think. She said, when we talked about this, the Ionic world periphery is not the world soul. So,
right.
And that's something very, in a sense, original. But you're pointing out, you've done a lot of research that she's drawing on some very possibly, certainly explicitly on Aristotle and Plato, but on ancient sources, or it's analogous to all sorts of ancient, like Neoplatonic speculation.
Yeah, and in that ancient tradition of the pre-Socratics, and in the like esoteric Plato and Aristotle, and there's this direction of analysis that moves to the things themselves, like to the phenomena, but then there's going from phenomena to first causes, and the one entails various forms of reduction, and the other is I think like a transcendental deduction or something like that. This is outlined in like the literature of the Tübingen Schule, in their discussions of Plato and these directions of analysis. One is more phenomenological and one is more ontological. So I mean, always in parallel and compatible, these two directions and methods of science are, but at the same time, there's this issue of idealism versus realism in various forms, and it's a big debate. Rodney recently came out with this book, actually just like last month, a collection of essays, including Rodney's introductory work, for the volume on the realism idealism debate. And of course, Husserl and Conrad-Martius factor, they figure prominently in this. but also like Nikolai Hartmann and all of these interesting discussions going on about different forms of real ontology and ideal ontology. These are terms in
what, I was talking to Jim the other night, and one thing he said about this I think is relevant, that he feels there are only 3 good candidates for a philosophy of nature in the 20th century: Conrad-Martius, Whitehead, and Nikolai Hartmann. And I know nothing about Hartmann, but that's, I don't know, just quoting
there's a few good works in English. I can send the PDFs around as well. Right. So I mean that's another interesting dimension of all this. But also in Husserl, and I think today, by the way, is Peter Manchester's birthday. He would have been 79. He was born in 42. So happy birthday to Peter Manchester. I think that reading Syntax of Time would be a really interesting candidate for where we proceed in 2022. But maybe even more immediately, what we should look at is this one, right? Since Jim's with us, and it would be really good to look at this. This has some really interesting sections in the beginning on Conrad-Martius and on the relationship between Husserl's Realontology and that of Conrad-Martius that informs this whole like big discussion about transcendental idealism on the one hand and real ontology on the other. So anyway, I've been having this with paired with this for thinking about like these matters of like the phenomenological attitude, the transcendental attitude, and method.
So he wrote that book before Ideas 1 and 2. He wrote that those lectures were given before Ideas 1 and 2.
Well, 1910 to 1911. So yeah, right around the time of those. I think 1 and 2 came out at the same time.
Yeah, there was like 13 or something.
Oh, okay.
Ideas 2 wasn't published. It just sat in his desk.
Okay.
He didn't want, he was afraid to publish it.
So just while we like wrap this up, on the 17th, I think Rodney's going to try to join us. We'll look at his introduction to the appendix, and I believe Jim will be here as well, and we'll look at the metaphysics of the earthly.
I read that, and I don't think we're going to learn much that we haven't already talked about. It was pretty simple to read for the most part. Rodney's introduction gave us a flavor for what both Stein's and Conrad-Martius' life was like during that heyday just prior to World War II. Not pleasant to live in.
Well, there's this one sentence I just wanted us to think about from this introduction to the appendix. On page 243, on to the next page, Rodney's talking about the circumstances of the writing of the metaphysics of the earthly. And there's just the sentence, this was to be a continuation of the project of the real ontology, broadened to a general ontology and metaphysics of the cosmos, and supplemented by an ideal ontology, dealing in particular with the, quote, structure of a naturally and systematically ordered living nature, and the problem of universals. So that covers a lot. Maybe it covers everything. But so anyway, that's the a general description in terms of real ontology as a component, as including an ideal ontology, for this final ultimate project, which really spans a few decades actually, but manifests as this little bit that we're going to see. I mean, we've already kind of discussed it at points, certainly surrounding this. the table of contents for the metaphysics of the earthly is kind of structured, at least the first part is structured in terms of these multiple bipolar, basic coordinates for the system that's going to be laid out, which gives you a kind of geometrical image, much like this crystalline diagram.
So this essay is kind of her first try at what she eventually worked out with her later works, Das Sein, die Zeiten der Raum, and the
Right.
Selbstabgau der Natur.
Yeah, but
And
at the
so it's
same
sort of-
time, this is more like having it all together, and those are like chapters of this that became books, and then she got more into those and developed those a bit more. But this is more overview and more like the big project that she's working on, her like summarizing her whole big metaphysical perspective. So that's why
maybe
this
that's a good way to end up. It's sort of a
Right.
chance to sort of step back and sort of try to pull it all together.
Right. And so what she then develops as like in D Sight, she really develops this idea of the aeonic world periphery, and that it has both a temporal aspect and a spatial aspect. And she develops all this in terms of like Kant and Aristotle and the categories of the Hule and etc., in terms of physics. But then also in Der Raum, she goes off and develops the idea of the apeirotic space-time based on like some stuff that Heisenberg says that sounds very much like Anaximander, as is pointed out somewhere in here. So she takes it in these directions and develops these ideas, but she's developing them out of this what's called like her ultimate systematics. So the seed for all of these weird categories, that characterize her work in philosophical cosmology and theology, come from this original intuition of like how it all goes together in terms of this fourfold root. Yeah, so it's very exciting.
Very naively, did we already share this diagram or table of hers, which you pointed at?
Yeah, so it should be in the emails. The diagram, some explanations of it, some interpretations of it.
Mhm.
But I think that this will again be described and connected for us when we go into the metaphysics of the earthly.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Well, with that, we should draw to a close. So we will meet again in 2 weeks on the 17th,
Mhm.
in the midst of our holiday madness. So I'll let you all go.
Bye-bye,
Thank you very
everyone.
much. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody.
As always.
See you next time.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.